Let's start with something that will reframe everything you thought you understood about how a narcissist pays attention. In the early stages of most narcissistic relationships, the attention they offer feels extraordinary, overwhelming even. The intensity of their focus, the apparent depth of their interest, the way they seem to see you more completely than anyone ever has it, is one of the most intoxicating experiences a person can have. And it is also, as many people discover too late, one of the most carefully constructed performances in the entire narcissistic repertoire. That early attention is not really about you. It is about the narcissist's need to understand what you require, what you respond to, what levers of admiration and validation will keep you oriented toward them with maximum efficiency. It is reconnaissance dressed as romance, and it serves a purpose that has almost nothing to do with genuine curiosity about who you actually are. But then something shifts, and the shift, when you know what to look for, is unmistakable, because there comes a point in the specific and relatively rare situation where a narcissist begins to genuinely fall for someone where the first attention changes in quality so fundamentally that it can no longer be explained by strategy alone. It becomes something denser, more specific, more personally calibrated than anything performance could produce. They begin to remember things that serve no tactical purpose. The offhand comment you made 3 weeks ago about something you read as a child, the particular way you take your coffee that you mention once, without emphasis, the name of a friend you reference briefly in a conversation that seemed entirely unremarkable at the time. Small details, specific details, details that a person collecting information for strategic deployment would have no particular reason to retain. This is the first and one of the most reliable signs that something has shifted beneath the surface of the narcissist's engagement with you. Because genuine attention, the involuntary, unstrategic kind that arrives when a person has actually become important to you, rather than merely useful, has a different texture than performed attention. It remembers differently. It focuses differently. It carries a quality of investment that cannot be entirely manufactured, no matter how sophisticated the first teacher. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about curiosity as one of the most authentic expressions of genuine human connection, observing that we are most truly present with the people who make us genuinely curious, not as objects to be understood for our own purposes, but as subjects whose inner world we are drawn toward without fully knowing why. When a narcissist begins falling, they may become overly attached to the other person and start to prioritize their own needs over the other person's feelings. This quality of authentic curiosity emerges often for the first time in their relational life with a force that surprises even them. They find themselves wanting to know not just what you respond to, but who you are. Not just how to keep you engaged, but what moves you, what shaped you, what lives beneath the surface of the person they are increasingly unable to stop thinking about. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, that to truly attend to another person, without agenda, without the filter of our own needs and projections, is one of the most profound acts a human being can offer. The narcissist who is falling begins, however imperfectly and however unconsciously, to approach this kind of attention, not because they have suddenly transcended their psychology, logical limitations, but because something in them has been activated that is stronger, at least momentarily, than the habit of using people rather than seeing them. They are studying you, not to use what they find, but because somewhere beneath the performance, without permission and without precedent, you have become the most interesting thing in their world. And for a narcissist, that is not a small thing. That is everything we've established. That the narcissist who is falling begins to pay a qualitatively different kind of attention, one that serves no strategic purpose, and therefore reveals something the strategy was designed to conceal. Now we need to examine what happens as that falling deepens. Because the intensifying feeling doesn't just change how they attend to you. It begins to do something far more dramatic and far more psychologically significant to the narcissist's most fundamental operating system. It starts to crack the mask, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because the mask, the false self that the narcissist has constructed and maintained across years, sometimes decades, of relational performance, is not a fragile thing. It is something, that yields easily, or surrenders gracefully, to the pressure of ordinary feeling. It has been reinforced by every relationship that came before, every successful performance, every instance in which the authentic self was offered and found the world unsafe, retreating back behind the constructed exterior, with another layer of protection, added to prevent the same breach from occurring again. The mask, by the time genuine feeling arrives, is extraordinarily robust. And yet, in the specific and rare experience of falling for someone whose depth genuinely matches their own hunger for connection, the pressure that builds from underneath becomes something the mask cannot entirely contain. What results is not a dramatic unveiling, not a sudden and complete revelation of the authentic person beneath the performance. It is something far more subtle, far more brief, and in many ways far more revealing, precisely because of its brevity. Fragments, moments, unguarded seconds that arrive without announcement and disappear almost immediately, as though the narcissist themselves is startled into retreat by their own accidental honesty, a flash of genuine fear in their eyes when you mention Levy first. NG, there and gone before they can replace it with the usual performance of indifference. A moment of real laughter, not the social laughter calibrated for effect, but the uncontrolled, unbeautiful, completely authentic laughter of someone who has been genuinely caught off guard by joy. A vulnerability offered in a sentence that ends abruptly, as though the words arrived before the internal editor could intercept them, followed by a rapid pivot to safer emotional territory. These fragments are easy to dismiss, easy to explain away, easy to absorb into the broader narrative of someone who is charming and engaging and socially skilled. But they are not performance. They cannot be, because performance requires the performer to be present and deliberate, and these moments arrive precisely in the gaps between deliberateness. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks with profound insight about the relationship between authenticity and safety, observing that the authentic self does not emerge in response to will or intention, but in response to the experience, however rare, of feeling genuinely safe enough to exist without protection. When a narcissist begins falling, the person they are falling for creates, first, simply by being who they are, a quality of felt safety that the narcissist system has almost no prior experience of navigating. And in that unfamiliar safety, the authentic self does what suppressed things always eventually do when pressure is removed. It surfaces, briefly, tentatively, with the cautiousness of something that has been underground for a very long time and is not yet certain the conditions are truly safe. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote that genuine encounter between two people, what he called the I-thou moment, cannot be manufactured or sustained indefinitely. It arrives, it illuminates, and it passes. But its passage does not erase what it revealed. Watch for the fragments. They are not accidents. They are the most honest thing the narcissist will ever show you. And they appear precisely because, in your presence, the performance is no longer entirely enough to hold the person underneath it. And we've established that the narcissist who is falling begins to pay attention in ways that serve no strategic purpose, and that the pressure of genuine feeling starts to fracture the mask in brief, unguarded moments that reveal something real beneath the performance. First, now we need to examine a behavioral pattern that emerges alongside these developments, one that is simultaneously more visible and more consistently misread than almost anything else the falling narcissist produces: the jealousy that refuses to declare itself. Because here's what makes narcissistic jealousy, in the context of genuine falling, so uniquely difficult to identify and so psychologically revealing once you do. In ordinary jealousy, the kind most people experience and most people recognize, there is a relatively direct relationship between the feeling and its expression. Someone feels threatened by another person's attention toward their partner, and that threat registers visibly. In the narcissist who is falling, this direct relationship is almost entirely severed. The jealousy is present intensely, sometimes overwhelmingly present, but its expression is routed through a series of psychological filters so sophisticated and so automatic that what arrives at the surface bears almost no resemblance to its origin. What you see instead is a performance of indifference so committed, so apparently effortless, that it would be entirely convincing if it weren't for the behavior first, or that runs beneath it like a current beneath a still surface. They notice everything. Every person who makes you laugh, every interaction that doesn't include them, every moment of connection you share with someone else, however casual, however brief, however entirely innocent in its nature. They notice with an attention that is completely inconsistent with the indifference they are performing. And while the performance continues, the relaxed posture, the casual tone, the apparent absorption in something other than what you are doing, the responses leak through in ways they cannot fully control. A subtle shift in energy when a particular name is mentioned. A question asked with studied casualness that contains within it the precise shape of the anxiety it is trying to conceal. A withdrawal, brief and almost imperceptible, that arrives in direct proportion to the attention you gave someone else and disappears the moment your attention returns to them. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about the body as the keeper of emotional truth, observing that what we refuse to acknowledge consciously finds its expression through physiological and behavioral channels that operate beneath the reach of, first, our conscious control. The narcissist's jealousy, denied at the level of conscious acknowledgement, does exactly this. It routes itself through the body, through micro-expressions, through the thousand small behavioral adjustments that occur when a person is managing a feeling too threatening to admit. And because the super-empath or anyone with genuine perceptual sensitivity reads these channels as naturally as most people read words, the jealousy communicates itself with remarkable completeness, even in the complete absence of explicit declaration. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the distinctly human capacity to simultaneously know something and refuse to know it, to hold awareness and denial in the same psychological space without resolving the contradiction. The narcissist performing indifference while experiencing jealousy is living in precisely this state. They know what they feel. Some part of them knows with complete clarity, but the acknowledgement of that feeling would require acknowledging the vulnerability beneath it, the fact that you have become important enough to them that your attention to others constitutes a genuine threat, and that AC, first. Acknowledgement is the one their psychological system will exhaust every available resource to prevent. Watch not what they say about how they feel. Watch what their behavior does when your attention moves away from them. The indifference is the performance. The jealousy is the truth. And the gap between those two things is exactly the size of the feeling they cannot yet bring themselves to. Admit we've traced the narcissists falling through the obsessive attention that serves no strategic purpose, the mask that begins fracturing in unguarded fragments, and the jealousy that performs indifference while burning underneath it. Each of these behavioral signatures reveals a person whose emotional experience has outgrown the containment system they have spent a lifetime constructing and maintaining. Now we need to examine something that intensifies alongside all of these developments, something that becomes more pronounced, more frequent, and more emotionally costly the deeper the falling goes. The testing escalates, dramatically, and almost always in direct proportion to how much losing you has begun to terrify them. To understand why genuine feeling produces more testing rather than less, first, why falling for someone makes the narcissist more destabilizing rather than more stable, we need to return to the foundational psychology that drives this behavior at its deepest level. The narcissist's relationship with trust, as we have established across this entire conversation, was fractured at the most formative stage of their psychological development. The people who were supposed to demonstrate that love was safe, consistent, and unconditional instead demonstrated through absence, through inconsistency, through conditional approval, that attachment is inherently unreliable and that need is inherently dangerous. And the psychological architecture built in response to that early lesson has never been dismantled. It has only been elaborated, reinforced, and made more sophisticated with each passing year. When ordinary feeling arrives, the manageable, surface-level engagement that characterizes most of the narcissist's relationships, this architecture is not significantly activated. The stakes are low enough that the anxiety remains contained. But when genuine falling begins, when the feeling grows large enough to represent a real and significant vulnerability, the first, or foundational architecture comes online with a force that is completely disproportionate to the present moment. Because the nervous system is not responding to you specifically. It is responding to the full, accumulated weight of every attachment that proved unsafe, every trust that was violated, every need that was met with disappointment or abandonment, and it responds the only way it knows how. It tests. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about how traumatized nervous systems cannot distinguish between past and present threat, how the body, in its attempt to protect us from repeating historical pain, activates the same responses to current situations that were originally developed for entirely different circumstances. The narcissist's escalating tests are this neurological reality made behavioral. Each test is the traumatized attachment system asking, with increasing desperation, the question it has never received a satisfactory answer to. Will you stay when staying costs you something? Will you remain when remaining is genuinely difficult? Will you choose me when choosing me requires you to absorb discomfort, uncertainty, and the specific kind of emotional labor that reveals whether an first attachment is genuine or merely convenient? What makes this so profoundly painful for the person on the receiving end is the complete invisibility of the logic driving it. From the outside, the escalating tests look like cruelty, like self-sabotage, like the behavior of someone who fundamentally does not want what they appear to be pursuing. And in a narrow, behavioral sense, that perception is understandable. But beneath the behavior is something entirely different from cruelty. It is terror wearing cruelty's clothing. It is the sound of someone who has finally found something worth keeping, and has absolutely no healthy mechanism for ensuring that keeping it is possible. The philosopher Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote that love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams. The narcissist falling in love is discovering this truth with full force, that the real experience of genuine attachment is not the idealized, painless connection their grandiosity imagined, but something raw and frightening and utterly beyond their capacity to control. They are not testing you because they want you to fail. They are testing you because passing has become the most important thing first. In their world. And they have no idea how to ask for that without making it feel like punishment. We have traced the narcissist falling through the obsessive attention, the fragmenting mask, the jealousy performing indifference, and the escalating tests, driven by a terror of loss that has no healthy outlet. Each of these behavioral signatures tells the same underlying story of a person whose emotional experience has grown larger than their psychological architecture was ever designed to contain. Now we arrive at something that synthesizes all of those preceding patterns into a single, specific, and extraordinarily revealing behavioral cycle. One that, once you recognize it, makes the narcissist's hidden feelings not just visible, but undeniable. They destroy, and then they immediately try to rebuild what they just destroyed. This cycle provocation followed by repair, distance engineered, and then urgently collapsed, wounds delivered, and then tended with a tenderness that seems to contradict everything that preceded it, is one of the most confusing and most psychologically significant patterns a falling narcissist produces. It is also one of the most consistently misunderstood, first, because from the outside, from the perspective of the person living through it, it looks like pure contradiction, like evidence of fundamental instability or deliberate manipulation, like the behavior of someone who simply cannot decide what they want and is making you pay the price of that indecision with your emotional well-being. But the contradiction is not the product of indecision. It is the product of a feeling so large and so threatening that the narcissist's psychological system cannot hold it steadily, cannot sustain the exposure that genuine closeness requires without the anxiety becoming overwhelming. And when the anxiety peaks, when the intimacy has reached a level that triggers the foundational terror of vulnerability and potential abandonment, the system does what it has always done when threatened. It creates distance, suddenly, often brutally, through provocation, through withdrawal, through the delivery of a wound, precisely calibrated to push you back to a range where the intimacy feels less threatening and the vulnerability feels more manageable. And then, almost immediately, something else happens, because the distance that was supposed to bring relief brings, first, something else entirely. It brings the very thing the provocation was designed to prevent, the felt experience of losing you. And that experience, for someone in whom genuine falling has taken root, is intolerable in a completely different way than the intimacy was. The anxiety of closeness is replaced by the panic of absence, and the panic drives them back toward you with an urgency and a tenderness that feels genuine because it is genuine. Both the wound and the repair are real. Both the pushing away and the pulling back are sincere expressions of the same underlying feeling, filtered through a psychological system that has no coherent way to hold them together. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about the push-pull dynamic of anxious attachment as the behavioral signature of a nervous system that learned, in its most formative period, that love and loss were inseparable, that closeness inevitably preceded abandonment, and that the only available response was to preemptively manage the distance before the loss could arrive on its own terms. The narcissist's sabotage and repair cycle is this attachment wound operating at full intensity, accelerated by the specific terror that genuine folly, first, NG produces in someone whose defenses were built precisely to prevent genuine falling from ever occurring. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote that in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. For the person navigating this cycle with a narcissist who is falling, the difficulty is real, and the cost is significant, but within it lies a piece of information of extraordinary value. The repair always reveals what the sabotage was trying to hide. They came back because the distance was worse than the vulnerability. They rebuilt what they broke, because losing it, even briefly, was more frightening than risking the exposure that keeping it requires. That return, in the narcissist's emotional language, is the closest thing to a declaration they are currently capable of making. We have followed. The narcissist's falling through the obsessive attention that serves no strategic purpose, the mask fracturing in unguarded fragments, the jealousy hidden beneath performed indifference, the tests driven by terror of loss, and the sabotage and repair cycle that reveals feeling too large to be held steadily. Each of these patterns tells the same essential story from a different angle of someone whose first emotional experience has outgrown the containment system they built to prevent exactly this kind of experience from ever taking hold. Now we arrive at a behavioral pattern that is quieter than the others, less dramatic in its presentation, and yet in many ways the most psychologically revealing of all. The campaign of quiet indispensability. Because when a narcissist begins falling genuinely and deeply, a new anxiety enters their psychological landscape alongside all the ones we have already examined. Not the anxiety of vulnerability, though that remains. Not the terror of abandonment, though that intensifies. Something more specific, and in some ways more unfamiliar than either of those, the anxiety of being genuinely unnecessary, of discovering that the person who has become the center of their emotional universe is, in fact, perfectly capable of existing, functioning, and thriving entirely without them. For most people, the recognition that someone we love is capable and self-sufficient is experienced as a source of admiration and security. But for the narcissist, whose falling has activated every underlying wound simultaneously, that recognition lands differently. It lands as first, Heat. Because the narcissist's psychological architecture, as we have established, requires a relational dynamic in which they occupy a position of indispensability, in which the other person's orientation toward them is not just voluntary but structurally necessary. And when the person they are falling for demonstrates, simply by being a fully formed and self-possessed individual, that their presence in that person's life is wanted, rather than needed, the distinction between those two words becomes, for the narcissist, a source of profound and destabilizing anxiety. The response is not to address this anxiety directly. That would require a level of emotional transparency that the falling narcissist is not yet capable of. Instead, the response is behavioral, systematic, and so gradual in its implementation that it often goes unnoticed until it has already achieved a significant degree of success. They begin positioning themselves as the solution to your problems before you have fully identified the problems yourself. They anticipate needs with an attentiveness that seems remarkable, and is remarkable driven not by selflessness, but by the urgent psychological necessity of being first. Woven into the fabric of your daily life in ways that feel natural, organic, and genuinely helpful rather than calculated. They offer assistance that creates gentle dependency. They make themselves present at precisely the moments when presence matters most. They construct, with patient and largely unconscious precision, a version of your life in which their role has become so embedded, so routinely relied upon, so quietly essential to the texture of ordinary experience, that imagining their absence requires a significant imaginative effort. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about the distinction between love offered from abundance and help offered from fear, observing that genuine generosity flows from a place of genuine fullness, while compulsive helpfulness almost always originates in an anxiety about one's own value and lovability. The narcissist's campaign of indispensability is the second of these in its purest form. Every act of assistance, every anticipation of need, every positioning of themselves as the answer to your problems is driven not by the desire to give, but by the terror of being found dispensable by someone whose assessment of their worth has begun to matter more than least anything else. The philosopher Aristotle distinguished between being loved and being needed, observing that the most enduring human connections are built on the first rather than the second. The narcissist falling in love does not yet understand this distinction. They are still operating from the only relational logic their formation taught them, that security comes from utility, that love is most reliably retained through indispensability, that the safest position in any relationship is the one that is hardest to vacate. They are not trying to trap you. They are trying to ensure that when you calculate the geometry of your life, the space they occupy is too significant to easily eliminate. That is not manipulation wearing the face of love. That is fear wearing the face of devotion. And underneath the fear, unmistakably and undeniably, is someone falling in a way they have never fallen before, and doing absolutely everything they know how to do to make sure this time, for reasons they cannot fully articulate even to themselves, you do not disappear. We have followed the narcissist, falling through every behavioral signature. It produces the obsessive attention, the frag me first, Ending mask, the jealousy disguised as indifference, the escalating tests, the sabotage and repair cycle, and the campaign of quiet indispensability. Each of these patterns reveals a person whose emotional experience has fundamentally outgrown the psychological architecture designed to contain it. Now we arrive at something that operates at a level more subtle than any of the patterns we have examined so far. Something that doesn't announce itself through dramatic behavior or visible emotional leakage, but through language. Through the specific, carefully hedged, deliberately deniable way the narcissist who is falling begins to speak about what comes next. They start talking about the future, but they frame every word of it as hypothetical. This is one of the most psychologically precise and most consistently overlooked behavioral signatures of genuine narcissistic falling. And to appreciate its full significance, we need to understand what the future represents in the narcissist's psychological economy, because it is considerably more than a temporal concept. For someone whose attachment system was formed around the expectation of loss, whose deepest relational learning was that first, looseness inevitably precedes abandonment, the future is not a neutral canvas of possibility. It is a minefield. It is the territory in which every attachment they have ever formed has eventually detonated. And to speak about the future with someone, to genuinely, vulnerably place yourself in an imagined shared tomorrow, is to expose yourself to a quality of hope that, for the narcissist, has historically been the precise precursor to the most devastating kinds of pain. And yet the falling produces a gravitational pull toward exactly that exposure. The feeling becomes strong enough that the future begins to populate itself, unbidden, with images of shared experience, places visited together, ordinary moments inhabited together, a life whose texture includes this specific person in ways that feel not just desirable, but somehow already inevitable. The mind of someone genuinely falling cannot help but move forward in time, cannot help but begin imagining. And for the narcissist, whose psychological defenses are formidable but not omnipotent, this forward movement of imagination eventually finds its way into language, but not directly, never directly, because direct future talk requires, first, a declaration of feeling, and declaration of feeling requires an acknowledgement of vulnerability that the narcissist system will exhaust every available resource to prevent. Instead, the future enters the conversation through the carefully constructed deniability of the hypothetical. We should go there sometime. Imagine if we did this together. That's somewhere I've always wanted to visit. You'd probably love it. Statements that contain within them the precise emotional content of genuine intention, while maintaining just enough grammatical distance that the feeling behind them can be retracted if the vulnerability becomes too exposed, if the other person's reaction suggests that the declaration has gone further than safety permits. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about the way trauma-informed psychology develops what he calls a double consciousness, an awareness that simultaneously reaches toward what it needs and prepares for the withdrawal of that reach if the environment proves unsafe. The narcissist's hypothetical future talk is this double consciousness expressed in its most linguistically precise form. Every softened, deniable, carefully hedged reference to a shared tomorrow is first, simultaneously a genuine expression of feeling and a protection against the consequences of that expression being received badly. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote that the imagination is not the faculty for forming images of reality. It is the faculty for forming images that go beyond reality, that sing reality. When the narcissist begins placing you in hypothetical futures with a consistency and a specificity that casual conversation cannot account for, what you are hearing is not idle speculation. You are hearing the imagination of someone falling, singing a reality they cannot yet find the courage to simply say out loud. The hypothetical is the declaration. The someday is the now. And the fact that they need the distance of maybe to say what they actually mean tells you everything about how much meaning it carries. We have traveled the complete landscape of what narcissistic falling looks like from the inside out. The obsessive attention that serves no strategic purpose, the mask fracturing in unguarded fragments, the jealousy performing indifference, while burning underneath it, the escalating tests driven by the terror of loss, the sabotage and repair cycle that reveals first, yielding too large to be held steadily, the campaign of quiet indispensability, and the hypothetical future talk that carries the full weight of a declaration the narcissist cannot yet make directly. Each of these patterns has told the same essential story, from a different angle of someone whose emotional experience has fundamentally exceeded the containment capacity of the psychological architecture they built to prevent exactly this from ever happening. And now, we arrive at the final piece, the one that is simultaneously the quietest and the most conclusive, the one that doesn't require dramatic behavioral analysis or sophisticated psychological decoding to recognize once you know what you are looking at, the one that has been present throughout the entire trajectory of the falling, visible in the background of every other pattern we have examined, but that deserves to be named clearly and directly in its own right. They are kinder to you than they are to anyone else in their life, and they are hoping, with a desperation they would never acknowledge, that you haven't noticed. Now, why would they hope you haven't noticed? That question is worth sitting with for a moment, because first, the instinctive assumption is that kindness is something people want to be seen, for that extending patience, consideration, and genuine care to another person is something most individuals would want acknowledged and appreciated. And for most people, that assumption is correct. But the narcissist who is falling occupies a fundamentally different psychological position, because for them, the kindness they are extending to you is not a performance. It is not a strategy. It is not something they are doing with conscious deliberateness, and therefore something they can take credit for without exposure. It is involuntary. And involuntary kindness, for the narcissist, is the most dangerous kind, because it reveals, with a clarity that no amount of performed indifference can adequately counteract, that you have gotten through, that something about you has penetrated the layers of constructed selfishness and strategic relatedness that characterize every other connection in their life, and produce something genuine. The patience they extend to you, that exists for no one else. The consideration that appears in your direction with a consistency and a naturalness that their closest observers feel. First, bewildering. The small, unremarkable, entirely unstrategic acts of care, the remembered preference, the unprompted check-in, the willingness to inconvenience themselves for your comfort, in ways they would never tolerate being asked to do for anyone else. These are not calculated. They are the behavioral output of a feeling that has taken root deeply enough to override the self-interest that normally governs every relational decision the narcissist makes. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about compassion as the natural flowering of a human being who has been allowed to be fully themselves, observing that genuine care for others is not a moral achievement, but a spontaneous expression of psychological wholeness. What the narcissist is producing in their kindness toward you is a partial, imperfect, psychologically complicated version of exactly this. Not wholeness, they are not there yet, and may never be, but a genuine reaching toward it. A momentary and real expansion of their concern beyond the boundaries of their own ego into the territory of actual care for another person's experience. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas built his entire ethical framework around the concept of the face, first, of the other, arguing that genuine moral life begins in the moment we truly see another person as a subject rather than an object, when their reality imposes itself on us with a claim we cannot ignore. The narcissist who is falling is experiencing, perhaps for the first time, something approaching this encounter. You have become, in their interior world, not just an object of desire or a source of supply, but something closer to a genuine subject, someone whose experience matters to them, in a way that operates independently of what that mattering produces for them. And the kindness that flows from that shift is real. It is the most honest thing they have produced in the entire relationship, more honest than their words, more honest than their declarations, more honest than anything they have consciously chosen to offer. Because it was never chosen, it simply arrived, the way real things always do, without announcement, without strategy, and without the narcissist's permission. They are kinder to you than they are to anyone else, because you have become more real to them than anyone else. And in a psychology built on the systematic unreality of other people, that is not a small ache. First, achievement. That is the whole achievement. And if you have been paying attention not to what they say, not to what they perform, but to the quiet, consistent, unremarkable kindness that appears in your direction, and nowhere else, then you already know what it means. They are falling, completely, helplessly, and in the only language their psychology currently allows them to speak. The question that remains, the one that only you can answer, is not whether their feeling is real. It is whether their feeling, real as it is enough to build something on, or whether loving someone who cannot yet say what they feel will cost you more than any feeling, however genuine, is worth.